elements of design and the elements that make up an image. We're going to talk about how we apply them, so how we use those elements in a work of art or design. So I'm just going to read through these and then we'll go into detail in what they actually mean. We're going to look at balance, emphasis, movement, pattern, repetition, proportion, rhythm, variety, and unity. And some of these will kind of get brought together. So balance, we can think about it as if you had an actual double beam balance in front of you, like you might use in the science class. So you can have two things that balance out and that are the same weight, even if they're not the same size. So some things are denser than others. So you take a lot of feathers that take up a lot more space in order to even out what a bowling ball equaled. We're going to do the same thing, but with images. So we use interest inside the image or inside the plane that we're working in, our composition, as how we're going to measure that weight. So if something's more interesting, it takes up more weight. So you can have small things that pack a really big punch, are very interesting and draw your eye. You can have big things that are kind of open feeling and that don't draw your attention all that much, and those two things would balance out. Overall, the reason we're going for this is that a balanced image is going to feel right to the viewer. It's going to make you feel at ease. Now, if you're wanting to design a poster for a horror movie, you might want to not have the viewer feel at ease. But unless you have a specific reason to put the viewer on edge, you want to create a balanced composition. There are many ways to achieve balance, but generally they're going to fall into three categories. Symmetry. Radial symmetry is a type of that. And then asymmetry, which is that thing where you have a small thing that's heavy and a big thing that's light going together. Now, within symmetry, other than radial symmetry, which is a whole other thing, we've got reflection and we've got translation. So these are all ways that you can achieve balance. I think examples are the best way to understand what they are, so I'm going to walk through these pretty quickly. We will talk about them more in class. So reflective symmetry is when one side is going to mirror the other side in an image. So if you look at this poster, they're not, if you fold it in half, they're not exactly the same, but you've got those two elements down the bottom that are kind of visually weighted the same. And so they're both in kind of boxes that are the same way. If you went down the middle, that you've got that guy hanging in the middle. So you've got an axis. In this case, it is a vertical axis. It's up and down. And there is a balance between those two sides. So it's symmetrical. Doesn't mean it has to be like if you're making a snowflake in craft class where you cut it and it's exactly the same all the way around. But if you squinted, you've got that two things looking the same on either side of down the middle or across the middle. This also is a vertical symmetry, vertical reflected symmetry. So again, you've got the positive and the negative of the image, but it's straight down the middle. Even the way that the text is weighted is straight down the middle. This one's Barbara Kruger on the left. Translation, on the other hand, takes the object, keeps the orientation the same, but moves it in space. So the way this bass clef looks like an ear, it's still in the same orientation. If it were to be mirrored, then you would have reflective symmetry, but in this case we're translating it, we're keeping it word for word the same but moving it over. Radial symmetry, which is that third item, is going to be around a central axis. So this goes around the center of the circle, almost as if you're on a merry-go-round and you're putting the same thing on each particular rung on the merry-go-round. You can see it here in the Saul Bass design, where we've got rock and roll, and the guy playing the saxophone is literally going all the way around your turntable. Asymmetry is when we've got a feeling of balance due to the fact that things are different enough. So in this case, we don't really have too much symmetry going on here. You could maybe try to put it down the middle because it's really tall, but even at that, it doesn't really balance out. There's areas where there's a lot more going on, and then there's areas where there's not a lot going on. And what ends up happening is the reason it feels okay is because the designer is taking care to balance out where there's visual interest with where there's areas for your eye to pause and to kind of wait and to have a moment's rest. If everything was chaotic everywhere and they didn't use all the elements we're going to talk about in terms of rhythm and movement and repetition, then you would feel overwhelmed and it would just be too much. Whereas there's just enough restraint here to keep the balance. One of the things you will notice about all of these elements is that they reference each other, because oftentimes you'll use them in conjunction to make a whole. Here's another example of asymmetrical balance where you've got a really dark small box, you've got a larger, less dark box, and those two things feel like they balance each other out. Now, emphasis is going to be an area that's visually dominant. So when we look at our composition, it's the place your eye is drawn to. A lot of times you're going to have one area where you want the eye to go, and then we're going to go from that area to other areas. Sometimes you can differentiate with size, with color, with texture, with shape, but usually you want a focal point in your design. And then you're going to want like focal point number 2 where you want the eye to go next. But it's important to have things have kind of a hierarchy so your eye feels like it knows where it wants to go first. We'll talk about where your eye lands in this image in class. Now, once your eye lands, as I kind of mentioned, you're going to want your eye to move somewhere else on the page and not just stay static in one spot. So I don't necessarily mean literal movement. I'll show you an example of that. But I also mean that even on a very static looking 2D page, I'm just going to go back to the last image in a second, your eye will move around the page. Your eye can be directed through lines, edges, shape, and color, but you want the viewer's eye to move around, but you want to control how the eye moves. So if you go back to that image that we just saw, your eye moves along the wing of the plane, and then it'll either hit the end of the wing and go down, or perhaps it's going to go down the center of that triangle and move along the path that the smaller planes take. No matter what, your eye will end up landing at the beginning of Air Corps of the US Army. And the way that they've lined that up is so that that ends almost exactly where we've got the beginning of the plane wing again. So your eye will then be drawn back around and back into the beginning. Great design will lead you on a circle so that way you'll never just leave the page and go off and kind of hit a dead end, but you'll always be directed back into the image itself. Here's a more literal movement where you've got a horse in motion, but we can look at how the artist has used staticness to convey that motion. But more often than not, when we're talking about movement, we're talking about where your eye is drawn and where it goes after that. And again, we can use things like perspective. And again, when we talked about space and space inside the visual plane where there is depth that is implied, here's another example with this photograph. Pattern is different than texture, but pattern is a uniform repetition of any of the elements in a design. Anything can be turned into a pattern through repetition. Some classic patterns are spirals, grids, weaves. We've got some examples here. We've got MC Escher. We've got a plate from classical times. Remember that it's not the same as texture. So texture is that kind of surface feeling. Texture is often less uniform and can add visual interest, but it's not repetition of an element, which is what pattern is. Now, I've used repetition. Repetition works with pattern, and it makes a work of art seem more active. Repetition of elements creates unity within a work of art or a design. So in this case, we have certain themes and certain images that are repeated. Now, in this case, it doesn't form a pattern all the time. We've got a pattern going on in the kind of, so if we've got the coat of arms, we've got 4 kind of areas in the coat of arms. In the top right quadrant, there's also 4 boxes. The top right, that one's got a pattern. Now, I would also say that there's repetition of this cross that's going on in 2 of the areas in that field and in 2 of the areas in the field that's on the bottom left. And you also have repetition of this lion. Now, we could argue back and forth about what makes a pattern. I would say that a pattern would be the stripes behind the lion, that it would be the diamonds in those other fields, that it would be the diamond with the weird cross thing that's in that top right. But while the lion doesn't make a pattern, it does have repetition, and that does help kind of bring everything together and make it feel uniform, despite the fact there's a lot going on in this. Again, some examples of using repetition to kind of create a feeling of unity. Proportion is that feeling of unity created when all parts relate well to each other. So again, we can think about this in terms of if you're drawing a person or you're drawing an animal. We can think about, do things seem like they fit together, that they all come from the same person? Or do we have a tiny person's head on a big person's body, and their right arm looks like it's a bodybuilder and the left arm looks like it belongs to someone who's been starving? And so when we look at things, again, do things feel right based on their relationship to each other within the whole? We can play with that in order to create visual interest, to create contrast within an image, and to try to play with the viewer's perceptions. Now, rhythm is created by movement that's implied through the repetition of elements in a non-uniform but organized way. So we're thinking about it again. We're talking about a feeling of movement that comes about because certain things are repeated in a way that isn't necessarily 1, 2, 3, 4, but in a way that is organized enough for us to recognize it. So if you think about it in music isn't always A, B, A, B, but sometimes it's A, B, C, B, C, A. Thinking about how there's repetition, but it's not always uniform. So where pattern demands consistency, rhythm relies on variety. So again, if you look at this image, you can see that there's a certain feeling of movement that's implied. It's implied through the way that certain things are repeated, but not in a strict way, the way that a pattern would be, but with a kind of variety. But there is enough of a method to the madness that you understand it. One of the classic rhythms of image making, specifically in design and in photography, is the rule of thirds. You can think of it like image making's common time. Common time in music is 4/4 time. Well, in design and photography, we'll think about it in thirds. And you can see here's an image which has got 3x3 axis laid over it, and you can see how the horizon here doesn't fall in the middle. If it falls in the middle, it's actually very static looking, but it falls 2/3 of the way up. And then you've got a feeling of space and movement because you've got a bit of perspective going on there. Now the perspective is moving towards the left-hand most third. The focus of your perspective is about halfway through that left-hand third root. And you've got the only figure in this image is in the bottom third, and balance out the fact that the horizon's in the top third. And while that person is in the middle, there is more going on texturally on that left-hand side. And so while the image is kind of maybe weighted towards that left-hand third, the other 2/3, the emptiness balances it off. And in terms of balance, the bottom left and the top right both have kind of values that are similar in order to balance each other out. So unity and variety are related in the way that some of these others have been related. Variety is the use of several elements of a design to hold the attention of the viewer and to guide the eye through and around your design. I'm talking about movement. We're using variety to move the viewer's eye around. Now, unity is going to be the feeling of harmony between all of the pieces of the work of art or design, which create a sense of completeness. So we're going to use balance. We're going to use all of the other things that we've talked about in order to make everything feel complete. We've talked about it in some of the ones I've used unity. Now, the thing with unity and variety is that too much unity creates monotony. It's boring, the image is static, no one cares. Too much variety creates chaos, your eye doesn't know where to go. It's too much, it overwhelms your senses, and you leave because you can't deal with it. Areas of interest in your composition, along with places for your eye to rest, are going to balance each other out and going to make things feel like very comfortable for the viewer. So think of it like pauses in music. Now, one of the things that helps with this is that our eye, our brain, is going to group things together that it thinks are similar. And it's going to form one unit out of those. So if we're looking at this image, the guys in fatigues, we're going to group them. And the 3 blondes who are wearing black, we're going to group them. So there is variety in that we've got those 2 groups. We've got the stuff that's around them. But there's unity in the way that we're grouping those things and we can make sense of them. Our eyes will connect things that are grouped together this way. And so something that's as chaotic looking as the photograph here on the right, we group through uniform connectedness. And so our brain can make sense of it in chunks, and that's how we can kind of bring unity to something that maybe has a little too much variety. So the thing that says Carco, and underneath it, it has Dayton tires, mufflers, auto top, seat covers, Uniroyal. We see that as one object. And then it's got another Carco splitting off to the left. We see the outright car and that's sitting on top of another sign as one thing. So by being able to group things in our brain, we can kind of bring order to the chaos. It's still a very chaotic looking image, so again, if you were trying to design something, you might still want to pare it back or to select items within it. But this becomes really important when you do things like user interface design. Again, we see things in blocks. So the objects at the bottom of our phone and that bottom little bar, we group those together. We visually think of them as, well, these are the most important things in this whole thing because they've got a box around them. So there's something about them that is the same. And what's the same in this case is that there are most important apps. Again, if you were to have the pull-out box where you had grouped apps together and they were coming out in that little box, and then you had the rest of the background around it, you would know that they had something in common because you grouped them that way. So our eye is going to make sense of things, our brain is going to make sense of things based on some rules, and uniform connectedness is one of them. We're going to go a little bit more into how our brain makes some sense out of lots of different information in the last set of slides, which is on Gestalt theory, which is a complicated German word that means basically that our brain makes the simplest thing possible out of the most complex things it sees.